In the year 480 BC, an enormous army crossed into Greece, larger than anything the ancient world had ever seen. Leading this force was the Persian king Xerxes, a ruler who believed his authority came from the gods themselves. To him, refusing to obey the Persian Empire was not just rebellion, it was an insult to divine order. His goal was not only to conquer Greece, but to erase the idea that small nations could live freely outside his control. As his army marched forward, its path eventually narrowed to a single stretch of land known as the Hot Gates, a tight mountain passage later called Thermopylae. There, a small group of Greek fighters prepared to block the most powerful empire on earth. At the heart of this defense stood 300 Spartan warriors, men trained from childhood to stand firm no matter the danger. Their stand at Thermopylae would become one of the most remembered moments in history. Over time, it turned into a symbol of courage in the face of certain death, of sacrifice against impossible odds. But beneath the legend lies a real story shaped by politics, geography, fear, and human choice. To understand what truly happened during those 3 days, it is necessary to understand the world that led to this moment. Thermopylae was not an accident of history. It was the violent collision of two very different civilizations. On one side stood the Persian Empire, ruled by the Achaemenid dynasty. This empire was the largest the world had ever known. Under leaders like Cyrus the Great and later Darius I, Persian control stretched from the plains of India to the deserts of Egypt. It was a highly organized state built around obedience to one supreme ruler. The Persian king was seen as chosen by the gods, and his word was law. Local customs were often allowed, but loyalty was non-negotiable. When Persian messengers arrived demanding submission, refusal was considered unthinkable. The empire was designed to absorb resistance, not tolerate it. On the other side were the Greeks, who called themselves Hellenes. Greece was not a single country, but a loose collection of independent city-states that often argued and even fought among themselves. Athens experimented with a new system of citizen rule that later became known as democracy. Corinth thrived through trade and wealth. Sparta built a harsh and disciplined military society unlike any other. Though divided politically, the Greeks shared language, religion, traditions, and a deep belief in personal freedom. To them, the idea that every person existed only to serve one king was deeply offensive. Greek identity was rooted in independence, and that belief would soon be tested. The roots of the coming war began years earlier along the coast of modern Turkey. Greek cities in this region, known as Ionia, lived under Persian control. In 499 BC, these cities rose up in rebellion. Athens sent ships to support them, a decision that deeply angered the Persian king Darius. Though the revolt failed, the insult remained. Darius swore revenge and set his sights on mainland Greece. In 490 BC, he launched his first invasion, expecting a quick victory. Instead, his army was defeated at the Battle of Marathon by a smaller force of Athenian soldiers. This shocking loss embarrassed Persia and stunned the ancient world. Darius planned another invasion but died before he could act. His son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the unfinished war. For Xerxes, Greece was not only a military problem but a personal mission. He intended to avenge his father, restore Persian pride, and crush Greek resistance forever. He spent years preparing, gathering troops, supplies, and ships from across the empire. Ancient historian Herodotus claimed the Persian army numbered over 2 million men. Modern scholars believe this was exaggerated, estimating the force was likely between 70,000 and 200,000 soldiers. Even so, it was overwhelming by ancient standards. When Xerxes finally moved west, his army crossed from Asia into Europe using massive bridges made of boats stretched across the Hellespont. The sight alone was meant to inspire fear. As the Persian forces advanced into Greece, city-states faced a terrible decision. They could submit and survive, or resist and risk destruction. Many northern cities chose surrender. Others believed resistance was the only honorable path. Athens and Sparta, former rivals, joined forces to lead a defensive alliance called the Hellenic League. The Greeks understood they could not fight Persia in open land. They needed terrain that could reduce the advantage of numbers. Their plan relied on coordination between land and sea. The Greek navy would challenge the Persian fleet at narrow waters near Artemisium. At the same time, a ground force would block the Persian army at a tight mountain pass. That pass was Thermopylae. Its narrow shape made it ideal for defense. The land squeezed between steep mountains and the sea, allowing only a small number of soldiers to fight at once. Thermopylae was named for nearby hot sulfur springs. In ancient times, the coastline lay much closer to the mountains than it does today. At its narrowest point, the pass was only a few dozen yards wide. This meant that the Persian army would be forced to attack in small groups, neutralizing its massive size. Cavalry could not operate effectively, and large formations would break apart. For the Greeks, this geography offered their best chance. The man chosen to command the defense was King Leonidas of Sparta. Sparta was Greece's strongest military state, and Leonidas was a respected leader. However, timing worked against him. The Persian invasion coincided with sacred Greek festivals, including the Olympic Games and a major Spartan religious event called the Carnea. During these festivals, warfare was forbidden. As a compromise, Leonidas was allowed to march north with only his personal guard of 300 Spartan soldiers. These men were not randomly chosen. According to tradition, each had a living son to carry on his family line, suggesting that death was expected. Though later stories focused only on these Spartans, they were not alone. As Leonidas advanced, troops from other Greek cities joined him. Together, they formed a small but determined force ready to defend the hot gates and delay the greatest army the world had ever known. By the time the Greek defenders gathered at Thermopylae, their combined force numbered roughly 7,000 men. Alongside the 300 Spartans were soldiers from several city-states. Thespis sent about 700 fighters who would later earn equal honor for their courage. Thebes contributed 400 men, though their loyalty would later be questioned. Phocis sent around 1,000 troops, familiar with the mountain terrain. There were also Helots, state servants of Sparta, who supported the army. Even with all these men, the Greeks were still vastly outnumbered. Xerxes' army may have been 20 times larger, yet numbers alone would not decide this fight. Most of the Greek soldiers were hoplites, heavily armored infantry trained to fight as a unit. Each hoplite wore a bronze helmet, chest armor, and leg guards. His main protection was a large round shield made of wood and bronze, heavy enough to cover most of his body. His primary weapon was a long spear, designed to strike enemies before they could get close. For close combat, he carried a short sword. Hoplites fought in a formation called a phalanx, standing shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields. This formation created a solid wall that moved and fought as one. In the narrow space of Thermopylae, the phalanx was devastating. The Greeks even repaired an old defensive wall that partially blocked the pass, strengthening their position further. Leonidas understood that discipline and patience would be their greatest weapons. Once the army settled into place, the Greeks waited for the Persians to arrive. When Xerxes finally reached the hot gates, he was unimpressed. To him, the Greek force looked small and insignificant. He believed their courage would collapse once they saw the full size of his army. Instead of attacking right away, Xerxes waited. For 4 days, his massive army camped near the pass. The delay was meant to intimidate the Greeks, giving them time to surrender without bloodshed. During this time, Xerxes sent scouts to observe the defenders. What they reported puzzled him. The Spartans were seen exercising, stretching, and calmly combing their long hair. To the Persians, this behavior looked foolish and arrogant. To the Spartans, it was a ritual preparation for battle. a sign that they were ready to die. Xerxes sent a final message demanding the Greeks lay down their weapons. Leonidas's reply, later remembered as a symbol of defiance, was simple and direct. He told the Persians to come and take them. Furious at this refusal, Xerxes ordered the attack on the 5th day. The Battle of Thermopylae had begun. The first Persian troops sent forward were Medes and Scythians, experienced soldiers who expected to overwhelm the defenders quickly. Instead, they ran into the Greek phalanx and stopped cold. The narrow pass prevented the Persians from using their numbers. Their lighter armor and shorter weapons left them at a disadvantage. Greek spears reached them first, striking with deadly precision while shields absorbed incoming blows. Persian attacks broke again and again against the wall of bronze. Bodies piled up in the pass, and the Greeks suffered few losses. Leonidas managed the battle with skill. He rotated units, allowing tired soldiers to withdraw while fresh men stepped forward. This kept the line strong throughout the day. Wave after wave of Persian troops charged, only to be driven back. Xerxes watched from a nearby seat, reportedly rising in alarm more than once as he saw his men fall. Frustrated by the failure of his regular troops, he ordered his elite force into battle. These warriors were known as the Immortals, the personal guard of the Persian king. Numbering 10,000, their ranks were always kept full, giving the appearance that they could not be destroyed. They were the best trained and best equipped soldiers Persia had. Xerxes expected them to break the Greek line where others had failed. But even the Immortals could not overcome the advantage of terrain and discipline. The Greek phalanx held firm. The Spartans, in particular, used clever tactics. They pretended to retreat, drawing Persian soldiers forward in disorder. At the right moment, they turned and reformed their line, cutting down the exposed attackers. By sunset, the ground was covered with Persian dead. The Greeks still stood strong. The first day ended in a shocking victory for the defenders. When morning came, Xerxes was angry and confused. He had expected an easy victory. Instead, his army had been humiliated. Believing the Greeks must be exhausted, he ordered attacks to resume. The second day unfolded much like the first. Persian soldiers charged into the pass and were slaughtered. The narrow ground forced them to fight head-on, where the hoplites excelled. The Greeks continued rotating their troops, keeping the line steady and unbroken. As the fighting continued, the pass became slick with blood. Persian casualties mounted into the thousands. According to ancient accounts, the losses were so severe that new attackers had to climb over the bodies of their own dead, slowing them further. The psychological toll on the Persian army was enormous. They had come expecting submission and fear, but instead faced relentless resistance. By the end of the second day, it seemed as though Thermopylae might hold indefinitely. Xerxes had learned that brute force would not work. The pass appeared unbreakable. The Greek strategy had succeeded beyond expectations. But fate would turn not through strength or courage, but through betrayal. As night fell, a local man named Ephialtes came before Xerxes. Seeking reward, he revealed a hidden mountain path that led behind the Greek position. This trail, known as the Anopa Path, was known to the Greeks. Leonidas had placed Phocian troops there to guard it. However, under cover of darkness, Persian forces led by the Immortals followed Ephialtes through the forest. Near dawn, they encountered the Phocians. Mistaking the Persians for the main army, the Phocians withdrew to higher ground. The Persians ignored them and continued their march. Soon, word reached Leonidas. The Persians were behind them. The trap was closing. The battle could no longer be won. Thermopylae, once a shield, had become a prison. When the warning reached Leonidas that the Persians were coming down the mountain path, the meaning was clear to everyone. The pass had been turned. The Greeks were about to be caught between two forces, one pressing from the front and another closing from behind. The narrow corridor that had protected them for 2 days was now a deadly cage. Leonidas understood that if the full Greek force remained in place, it would be surrounded and destroyed. The mission had always been to delay Xerxes, not to throw away the entire allied army in one sudden trap. The question now was how to save as many men as possible while still holding the pass long enough to prevent a panic and a massacre during retreat. Leonidas quickly called a council with the leaders of the allied troops. The arguments were intense. Many commanders urged a full withdrawal. They believed the army should pull back while there was still time, regroup farther south, and fight again later. From a practical point of view, it made sense. The Greeks had already achieved something extraordinary. They had held the largest invasion force in the world for days and inflicted terrible losses. They had proven the Persian army could be stopped. Saving the troops now would protect Greece's future defense. But Leonidas faced a different kind of pressure. He was a Spartan king, and Spartans were raised with a strict code that placed duty above life. Retreat carried a heavy meaning in Spartan culture. Even if it was wise, it could be seen as shameful. Historians have debated why Leonidas chose what he chose next. One possibility is that he believed he had no choice because of Spartan law and tradition. Another is that he was guided by prophecy. Ancient stories claimed that an oracle had warned Sparta that either their city would fall or one of their kings would die. Some believed Leonidas accepted the role fate had assigned him. Another explanation is cold military calculation. A retreating army moving out of the narrow pass would be vulnerable on open ground, where Persian cavalry could ride them down. Someone had to remain behind as a rear guard to cover the withdrawal. Leonidas may have chosen to sacrifice himself and a smaller force so the larger Greek army could escape and fight again. Whatever his reasons, his decision was swift. He ordered most of the allied troops to leave the pass while they still could. The retreating soldiers would carry word south and strengthen the defenses ahead. Leonidas would remain with his 300 Spartans. The story often ends there, as if only Spartan blood was spilled, but the reality was more complicated and more human. A group of 700 men from Thespiae, led by their commander Demophilus, refused to go. They knew exactly what staying meant. They chose death rather than withdrawal, standing beside the Spartans not because they were forced, but because they believed the stand mattered. The Theban contingent also remained. Ancient sources suggest different reasons for this. Some accounts imply Leonidas did not fully trust Thebes and feared they might side with Persia, so he kept them close. Others say they stayed because they had no safe way out. Whatever the truth, they were there when the final day began. Along with the Spartans and Thespians, there were also Helots who remained with their Spartan masters, sharing the danger even though they had far fewer rights. When the retreat was complete, the last defenders likely numbered around 2,000 men. They were about to face the full strength of Xerxes with no hope of survival. As morning approached, Xerxes prepared to end the resistance. He waited long enough to let the Persian force that had marched over the mountains move into position behind the Greeks. Once the net was ready, the king ordered the attack. The defenders understood they were fighting a different kind of battle now. For the first 2 days, they had relied on the narrowest part of the pass, where Persian numbers meant little. On the third day, knowing they would be surrounded, Leonidas chose to move forward into a wider area. His goal was no longer to hold ground for as long as possible. His goal was to kill as many Persians as he could before being overwhelmed. What followed was chaotic and brutal. The final defenders charged into the Persian front ranks with desperate force. Spears drove forward. Shields slammed into bodies. The Greeks fought with fury, no longer saving strength for later. Each man knew there would be no later. The narrow pass echoed with shouts, metal striking metal, and the dull impact of weapons hitting flesh. The Persian soldiers were shocked by the sudden aggressive push. They had expected the Greeks to stand still and be crushed. Instead, they were met with a wild storm of bronze and courage. In the middle of this violent struggle, Leonidas was killed. The exact moment and manner are not known with certainty, but ancient accounts agree his death was a turning point. When the Spartan king fell, the defenders fought fiercely to recover his body. According to tradition, they drove the Persians back several times, refusing to let their king be taken. During this struggle, two of Xerxes' brothers were said to have been killed, showing how close the fighting became and how costly the Greek resistance was even in its last hours. As more Greeks fell, the battle grew desperate. Spears broke from heavy use and hard impacts. When the long weapons snapped, the fighters drew their short swords. When swords were lost, they used whatever remained, even broken spears and pieces of shield. Men fought face to face, pushing, striking, grappling, refusing to step aside. But the defenders were shrinking. Every minute brought more Persian soldiers into the fight. The Greek line could not replace its losses. The Persians could. Then the sound the Greeks had feared came from behind. The Persian troops who had marched through the mountains arrived in the rear. The defenders were now fully surrounded. The last Greeks gathered around Leonidas's body and fought their way back toward a small rise of land. It was not a fortress, just a slight hill, but it offered a final place to stand close together. There, the remaining Spartans and Thespians prepared for the end. The battle was no longer about stopping an invasion. It was about refusing to be erased in silence. Ancient writers described the final moments in dramatic detail. They said the defenders fought until weapons failed and hands were all they had left. Whether every detail is literal or not, the message is clear. The last defenders did not surrender. They did not run. They chose to meet death as soldiers, buying time with their lives. For Xerxes, the victory was coming, but it was coming at a price he had never expected to pay. The Persians pressed in from every side, but the last defenders on the low hill refused to break. They stood packed close, shields lifted where they still had them, bodies leaning into one another to keep a tight front. Dust hung in the air, mixed with sweat and the sharp smell of blood. Xerxes had finally opened the hot gates, yet even now his soldiers could not simply step over these exhausted Greeks. Every step forward still cost lives, and every fallen Greek seemed to take enemies with him. Herodotus says the Persian commanders grew unwilling to keep pouring men into a brutal hand-to-hand struggle against fighters who would not yield, so they changed their method. They pulled their infantry back and signaled the archers to move forward. Then the sky filled with arrows. Earlier in the battle, Greek shields and bronze armor had helped the hoplites survive in the narrow pass. On this exposed hill, surrounded on all sides, those protections could not save everyone. Arrows struck shields, helmets, shoulders, and legs. The last men still standing tightened their circle as the storm continued, until bodies fell and the hilltop grew quiet. Not every Greek died in the same way. Herodotus reports that the Theban group, seeing the end was unavoidable, surrendered during the last phase of the struggle. They approached the Persians as prisoners, hoping to be spared. In later Greek memory, this decision stained their reputation, and some were treated as traitors in the stories that followed. For Xerxes, surrender mattered less than the fact that the pass was now open. The road into central Greece was clear, and his army could finally march south without a wall of spears stopping it. When the killing stopped, Xerxes walked among the bodies. He had achieved a complete battlefield victory, but it did not feel clean or easy. Thousands of Persians had died against a force that should have been crushed quickly. In a sharp burst of anger, he ordered a harsh punishment for Leonidas even after death. Persian custom often honored brave enemies, yet Xerxes wanted to send a message that defiance would be answered with humiliation. He ordered his men to find the Spartan king's body. Leonidas's head was cut off and displayed, and his corpse was treated with public disrespect, an act meant to crush Greek pride as much as Greek resistance. From a narrow military view, Thermopylae was a Persian success. The defenders were wiped out and the pass was taken. Xerxes' forces poured into central Greece. Athens, unable to stop the advance on land, evacuated many of its people, moving families to safer places and onto ships. The Persians entered the city and burned what they found, leaving ruins where proud buildings had stood. If you judged the campaign only by captured ground, the stand at the Hot Gates would look like a brave defeat with little value. But Thermopylae was never meant to be a final victory. It was a sacrifice meant to buy time and to shape the spirit of Greece. The delay allowed Greek leaders to coordinate their next steps and gave civilians a chance to move away from danger. It also proved something that mattered as much as any wall or weapon. It proved the Persian army was not unbeatable. For 2 days, the world's greatest empire had been held in place by a small coalition of independent city-states. Stories of that resistance traveled quickly, carried by survivors, runners and sailors, and repeated in marketplaces and camps where nervous men needed hope. That belief mattered at sea as well. While the land battle raged, Greek ships fought the Persian fleet near Artemisium. The naval fighting there was difficult and costly, but it prevented the Persians from instantly controlling the waters and trapping the Greek forces. After Thermopylae fell, the Greek fleet withdrew to a stronger position. Then, about a month later, came the clash that changed the war, the Battle of Salamis. In narrow straits, the Greeks drew the larger Persian navy into cramped water where its size became a weakness. The Greek ships struck hard and turned the confined space into an advantage, winning a major victory that shocked the invaders. That defeat forced Xerxes to rethink the entire campaign. Without reliable naval control, keeping a massive army supplied in hostile land became far more difficult. Xerxes returned to Asia with much of his force, leaving a commander behind to continue the fight in Greece. The next year, the Greeks gathered a full combined army, including a large Spartan force that had been held back earlier by sacred festivals. At Plataea, the Greeks met the remaining Persian army in a decisive land battle and broke the invasion, ending the threat for good. Without the delay at Thermopylae, and without the shock and inspiration it created, those later victories might not have happened in the same way. The stand at the Hot Gates did not win the war, but it helped make victory possible. It gave Greece time, and it gave Greece a story that united rival cities around a shared cause. Courage became contagious. Defiance turned into discipline. When people believe they can win, they fight differently, and Thermopylae helped create that belief at the moment it was most needed. Nearly 25 centuries later, the legend still endures because it speaks to something human and familiar. It is the story of limits being pushed by duty, training, loyalty, and choice. It is the story of a few deciding that some things are worth more than survival. Near the site, a memorial was raised with a short line from the poet Simonides. It tells passing strangers to report back to Sparta that the men who died there lay where they fell, faithful to their laws. The words are brief, but the message is lasting, and it explains why the defeat at Thermopylae became, in memory, a kind of victory.